So America illegally bombed Syria and Iraq last night. Flagrant violation of international law, attack on two sovereign countries without any kind of authorization from the UN Security Council, and no credible claim to be acting in legitimate self-defense using armed force as a last resort. According to the American statement, the facilities that were destroyed, there were two facilities on the Syrian side of the border, one facility on the Iraqi side of the border. According to America, these facilities have been used by the Iraqi resistance to launch drone attacks against American military targets inside of Iraq by the Iraqi resistance over the past several weeks. I did a video before previously covering how the Iraqi resistance launched a drone attack against a CIA hangar in America's military base in Erbil in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. And various other drone attacks of that kind have been carried out by the Iraqi resistance in recent weeks. Essentially, it should be remembered that these are Iraqis in their own country fighting against a foreign military presence, which in January 2020, after America unlawfully murdered the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad and the PMF commander, Iraqi PMF commander Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes in the same strike, in violation of international law. Various of these groups formed in order to attempt to expel the American military from Iraq, and that decision was made after the Iraqi parliament, which is elected, voted to expel American soldiers from Iraq. And America completely rejected that decision by the Iraqi parliament and essentially said, we're not going to withdraw under any circumstances. America now uses the excuse that the Iraqi government has requested its presence in Iraq to try and prove that its presence is legitimate, but it should be remembered that the current Iraqi government, led by Kadhimi, has not been elected by the Iraqi people, whereas the Iraqi parliament is, at least in some sense, elected, unlike the Iraqi government. And the Iraqi government, by continuing to allow the presence of American soldiers in Iraq, is rejecting and ignoring that decision made by the elected Iraqi parliament. Which is why these resistance groups in Iraq now try to expel the Americans using armed force. Though it should be remembered that most of these attacks that have been carried out by the Iraqi resistance against American military targets in Iraq have resulted in very minimal casualties. It's very rare that an American soldier or an American contractor is killed in one of these attacks, but it's actually far more likely now, following this American aggression against Iraq, that the Iraqi resistance will use that as a pretext to escalate their attacks against the American occupying forces and actually inflict serious casualties now in an effort to expel the Americans. And the American aggression last night against Iraq did result in 4 Iraqi deaths. These were fighters in Brigade 14 in the PMF and Kataib Saeed al-Shahada, both of which played an instrumental role in defeating ISIS. The PMF was formed in 2014 after a fatwa by Ayatollah Sistani in Iraq calling on Iraqis to defend their country from ISIS. It's essentially a coalition of paramilitaries, primarily Shias, but also Sunnis, Yazidis, Christians, Shabak, other ethnic groups. One of the fighters who was killed last night belonged to the Shabak ethnic minority, which was ethnically cleansed by ISIS. So it gives you an idea of who these guys are. They're ordinary Iraqis who took up arms to try and defend their country and their people from the existential threat that ISIS posed. So this American aggression is very likely to upset and anger a large swathe of Iraqis who support the PMF and support these groups which have defended the country from ISIS. America is trying to frame this campaign, this conflict between itself and the Iraqi resistance as a proxy war between America and Iran, that Iran is kind of attacking American forces through these so-called proxies and America is hitting back in order to put pressure on Iran. And the section of the left has also brought into that narrative, framing it as a proxy war between America and Iran. But it should be remembered, even though these groups are undoubtedly ideologically aligned with Iran and receive some level of support from Iran, none of them operate on instructions from Iran. No one with any knowledge of Iraq claims that these groups are operating on orders from Iran. This is very much an internal Iraqi situation where you have Iraqis who, for very understandable reasons, historical and more current reasons, are upset at the American military presence in Iraq and are trying to liberate their country from what they perceive as a foreign occupation. And America, regardless of how America views the situation, or views Iran as the main puppet master in the situation, that's very far from accurate. These are fundamentally Iraqis who are fighting against a foreign military presence in their country, and America is now fighting to crush the resistance in order to maintain its military presence in Iraq, regardless of the Iraqi parliament's decision, and even if it means killing the people who did the most to defeat ISIS.